So now we're reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is Yogananda's book of prayer demands and poems. And I had a hard time deciding on just one. So you guys are lucky today. You're actually going to get two for the price of one. And these I'm going to be sharing, we'll both be sharing this morning. It's such a wonderful topic. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on our affirmation, which is on work today. So this is number 134, and I'm going to read 135 also. They happen to be right behind each other. So the first one is, bless me that I may perceive thee through the windows of all activities. Bless me that I may perceive thee through the windows of all joyous activities. Look upon me and cheer me always as I engage in my daily duties. Let my every action, whether waking, sleeping, or dreaming, be sprayed by the fountain of thy presence. And now the next one, number 135. Father, teach me to perform all my work only to please thee. Let me feel thee as the electricity of life, moving the machinery of my bones, nerves, and muscles. In every heartthrob, every breath, every burst of vital activity, teach me to feel thy power. Om, peace, amen. Such a beautiful reminder on how to do our work. There was a manager who was interviewing a potential candidate for a job in a retail store. And he says to the applicant, he says, for somebody who has no experience in this field, you sure are asking for a lot of money. And the applicant says, well, when you don't know what you're doing, the work is so much harder. Tell the other one? Remind me what the other one is.
About the applicant who's new and he's talking with.
Oh, he's interviewing somebody? Okay, I used to be in human resources, so this one's a dear one to my heart. There was a human resources manager. She was interviewing a potential applicant. And the applicant, she asked him, she asked the applicant, how much do you want in terms of a salary? And the applicant says, a lot of money, probably. And I'm sorry, I'm not, and you better tell.
I'm channeling. And the interviewer said, oh, okay. So how about 4 weeks of paid vacation? And we'll have a vacation home for you. And would a Mercedes be okay? And the interviewee is going, yeah. He says, you're kidding. And the interviewer said, yes, but you started it.
That's it. I didn't want to miss the punchline. It's so important. It is so much harder to do the work, isn't it, when you don't know what you're doing? But what our reading from the Rays of the Light reminded us, it's so much harder when we don't have that soul receptivity. We don't have to the divine. I was remembering when I first moved to Ananda, I was afraid I was going to be told you had to meditate, meditate, meditate all the time, because that was hard for me. When I first came to the path, I've shared, I know in other talks, I come from New York City. I always prided myself on how many things I can do at the same time. And to sit and meditate, that was way out of the question. Finally, I had a teacher who really, really knew how to help me. He said, okay, can you give me 2 minutes? I said, well, I can give you 2 minutes. He goes, okay, that will be your meditation time. I said, whoa. So I promised 2 minutes, but twice a day. And from that, see, starting from where you are, and he really tuned into where I was. I couldn't do a half hour. I couldn't do 20 minutes. I couldn't do 15 minutes, much less twice a day. Because we talk about the practice of meditation. You have to do it regularly. That's how you build the habit. But 2 minutes a day I could give him. So I was really proud of myself. But I was relieved getting back to my story of when I first moved to Ananda. What I heard was meditate, serve. Meditate, serve. Meditate, serve. And what are our two topics today? The importance of soul receptivity, right? Being in tune with the divine, feeling for that connection, and then serving, right? What happens when we meditate? We lose our sense of self, right? We realize we're not this body. We're not Ganga Mata from New York City who loves coffee and pizza or whatever it is, right? We let it go. We lose that sense of self. What happens when we serve? We expand that sense of self. Isn't that awesome? You can see how the two can work really beautifully together. And the masters, the great ones, they come to remind us of that connection, of who we really are. We are what we discover in meditation by steadfast and regular meditation. I do meditate more than 2 minutes twice a day now. Okay, but it's been how many years? And it doesn't matter where you start. 50% increase. It doesn't matter. You know, if you start at the bottom, you just go up. But, you know, it doesn't matter. But it's that practice, that regular commitment. And our reading, it's so beautiful. I'm always amazed every week. I'm like, okay, what's the topic? And what's the affirmation? And I go, huh? And then when you start looking into it more deeply, they're so beautiful together. See how that meditation and service, they feed each other. Because what happens if you just serve, right? Even if you're offering your service to God, what happens? You can get tired, right? You can get frustrated. Oh, I'm always serving my family. I'm always cooking and cleaning for them. Oh, at work, I'm always serving my boss or bosses or my coworkers. Oh, and then my church is always asking me to serve. I mean, even if you know you're not doing it for the actual organization, you're doing it for God, for Divine Mother, if you're, bless you, if you're not tied into that soul receptivity, that deep connection. So it's so important that we keep our meditation up, that we do that. But we gain what? In meditation, we lose our sense of self, the small S. We always talk about that capital S of who we really are. Once we start to even touch on that we're peace, we're joy, we're love, then what do? Then we get to share it. And then that service, it's not about us. It's not about what we can physically do right now or mentally. We find we could do so much more. Have you ever come? Many of us have served so many times. I'm preaching to the choir now, literally. We've come to so many service days. We were reminiscing when we were remodeling the temple here and how we get into situations where we never have enough money. And so a lot of us, we have to all put our energy into it. But as a result, what happens? This place is now ours. We have all these fond memories of when it was. See my sound? And then where it was so cold, I remember one Sunday service, I was like, oh, we were passing out all the yoga blankets so people could stay warm, and there was no sound, so I was yelling, you know, the voice of God. You know, all these memories, we become something different through them. We discovered we are energy. We're not confined to, again, what we see. And so, again, the beautiful reminder. We had Swami Kriyananda come and visit, maybe now it's 3 years ago, and he had given a big weekend here. He spoke, many of you remember, he spoke in town at the Newmark. He came out to Laurelwood, just gave talk after talk, and at the end of the weekend, I wanted to thank him. And I didn't quite get this concept of meditation and service and how we're tuning into something deeper. Swami always lived at that place. He was always connected to the divine. It was never him physically doing it, but I wanted to thank him anyway. And so I thank him for everything he's done. And he just looks at me and he points up, you know, implying God. So then I go on and I thank him again. He goes, it's not me. It was God working through me. God was doing everything. Well, I still didn't get it. And again, I want to thank him. And he goes, listen. And he goes, you know, come on. You know, it's not me. It's the divine. When you open yourself up to the divine, to God, to spirit greater, it's limitless what can happen. So I want to end with just him. There's a beautiful quote of his. Swami Kriyananda once said, I used to offer every thought to master, but then I realized I offer everything, every thought, every feeling and activity to him. Kriyananda would say, I no longer know where Kriyananda ends and Master begins. It's all one to me. So that's the blessing we get, the opportunity we have in this lifetime. It's all one to me. So, God bless you all.
Though fallen deep in sin, by men abandoned, if longing for his grace, truth be your guide, he shall redeem you from every evil. Friends, only think of him. It's the song we started with this morning. And Yogananda, I always cringe when I hear the word evil and sin and stuff like that. It makes my skin creep. But Yogananda so beautifully defined sin as ignorance. And the Bhagavad Gita, we're talking in front of an altar that is well decorated with imagery that is not from the West. The Bhagavad Gita, the Bible of India, if you will, and the scriptures, they say that the biggest problem in life is missing the point. Missing the point, ignorance. We think that we know how life is supposed to be. And, look in the mirror and ask yourself the question, how's that working for you? Because the masters all tell us that it's endless joy, that it's boundless love. That's our birthright. That's the fabric of how we're made. That's the fabric of the universe. And if we're not experiencing that, we're missing the point somewhere, and maybe a lot of places. I love the Bible, increasingly across time. I kind of grew up with a little resistance to Christianity. I kept, proselytizing was common where I was, and nobody seemed to really understand what they were talking about, but boy, they were going to make sure I was towing the line with it. And so I was very put off. We had the blessing of going to the Holy Land this year, and the connection with Jesus as an avatar, as a yogi, as a channel for the divine light became increasingly powerfully awake inside. But I've drawn a lot in this life, once I came to Ananda, from the Eastern teachings, because I didn't have that predilection, I didn't have that kind of resistance built in. And I found the epic of the Mahabharata, which is from India. It is the longest poem ever written in any language. It's 100,000 verses long. And it is an allegory for what happens for the soul going out, being born and going out from God and finding its way back. We fortunately, in the Festival of Light, which we do every week, we have a much shorter version. It takes about 15 or 20 minutes to share that, as opposed to however long it takes to channel 100,000 verses. But we tell stories periodically. I've listened to it now, I've studied it, I've shared it, I've read it, many times. And it lives inside of me. And some of the things that are so fascinating about it, and they're relevant to today, really, if we had a gift to give, it would start, and especially around this topic of soul receptivity, it would be to start with the thought of being willing to question our own assumption of how we think life is supposed to be. We're so certain we know where happiness comes from. And then we impose that on our religion, we impose that on our friends, we impose that on our thoughts, we impose that on the experiences of our life. And life seldom measures up. In fact, if we are committed at all outwardly, it never completely measures up, because always things erode and change. It's the nature of creation. It's supposed to. It's not broken. But if we are committed wrongly, if we miss the point of where happiness comes from, then we suffer. It's just that simple. So the Mahabharata, we're going to talk about the Mahabharata. Well, actually, there's a very sweet story of a very saintly soul that was born in India. This isn't from the Mahabharata, but it's from India. And he was arrogant in his spiritual knowledge. He knew most of it. He knew a whole lot, but not all of it. And he had a teacher, and his teacher took him as far as he could, and then he said, I can't help you any farther. You need to go. Your guru, is in this little village over there, and you need to go and ask for this one particular woman over there. And he was put off because it was a woman, so he missed the point there. But he got there, and he knocked on this door, and he heard this woman say, "I'll be there in a little bit." And, you know, here he was, so full of his own righteousness and certainty of how important he was because he knew the truths. And he just waited and waited and waited. And he was becoming increasingly impatient and restless and uncomfortable in his own skin. And finally she shows up and she says, "Oh, hello, it's nice to see you." And he says, "Where have you been?" And she says, "I was serving my parents." And he could see by her demeanor, he could feel from her emanating this enormous spiritual power and wealth and simplicity and wholeness. And he realized, and he said, "Well, how did you get?" She says, she said to him, "Your impatience is not my problem, and I know why you're here." And she exhibited qualities of understanding and perception that showed him how great she was. And he said, "How did you attain this spiritual state?" And he said, "By serving my parents." And on the way from there, he was kind of pondering this, and he was told to go some other place to find a man in another village. And he got there, and on the way, he was just pondering this, and he heard some crow going, and he had enough power, and the crow disturbed him, so he just looked up, and with a dirty look, and the crow fell down dead. And he gets to this other village, and the person he's looking up turns out to be a butcher. And again, he gets put off, and he's fuming and fussing. He's wondering, how could it possibly be somebody who handles meat, which is unclean? How could this be a saint? How could this be a guru? And as he's thinking all this stuff, he hears the man call out and say, "I'm not your crow." We think we know what the masters look like. We think we know what life is designed to give us. And the epic stories, the stories of India, help us to break the illusion, if we tune into them, if we receive, that we know. And it can help us to soften our hearts and our minds, to start to receive a deeper understanding that spirit is everywhere. It doesn't mean that it's awake everywhere, but spirit is everywhere. Swami talks of, often people who he feels superior to, he felt superior to, or might be a little foolish in something. God, Divine Mother, would use them to impart to him some bit of knowledge that he deeply needed to know. He says he had a very hard time, getting past the ego. And he was talking about, he was working on humility, and which is an essential quality for anybody who's interested in experiencing joy and light and the presence of spirit. But then he discovered that he was becoming very proud of his humility. Dang, it's very hard to do what we're trying to do. But one of the things that we can do is we can stop cooperating with that voice in our head and that voice in our heart that we know how it's supposed to be. And we can start to listen more deeply behind that. And it's in work. I looked up work and service. It was really fun because in the affirmations that Kriyananda offered us as weekly touchstones of spiritual qualities, he has both work and service. And I was thinking, what's really the difference? Because we're taught to offer everything that we do, our work, back to God. Everything should be service. But work is energy and effort focused on a particular end. And then service is the offering of our efforts and our energies in support of others in kindness and respect. But work is valuable. Work is precious because it gives us a place when we're not meditating inwardly. If we only have the capacity for 2 or 3 minutes twice a day to be in the silence and the presence of God, the rest of the time we're either behaving in a way that cooperates with those 2 or 3 minutes or works against them. And working with the right attitude, being engaged in life, allowing the flow of life force, of spirit to move through us without a need to have it look a certain way, without it needing to refer back to us through pay or through compliments and aggrandizement, is extremely freeing. They call it nishkam karma in the scriptures. It's action without the desire for fruits of the action. And to use it increasingly in self-offering. I offer to thee the best that is in me. I offer to thee, I offer to life, I offer to creation the very best that is in me. I allow life to flow through me with attention and focus toward a given end. The Mahabharata is really fun because it takes us immediately out of the box. And I wanted to tell a few stories, and actually the best way to tell those stories is to have you come on Wednesday nights when we're telling it. We've got 8 hours worth of storytelling from the Mahabharata, and you're all invited. But one of the first things that happens, just as a way of helping us understand how far off we can get, and the fact that the divine is always working in ways that we don't understand to affect our lives. At the very beginning, God the Father, he's represented by this great king. And this great king marries, he's lonely, everything's perfect but, and that's a theme that's always in there. Everything is perfect except. And so we're always working against that, trying to fix that thing that's not quite right. So anyway, he's perfectly happy, he's ruling the kingdom, everything's wonderful, except he's lonely. And one of the things that kings do is they conquer territories, but they also like to have heirs. They like to have sons to carry on the tradition and the lineage. And one day he's down by the river Ganges, and the river's flowing by, and they consider the river to be a goddess in India. And he's just there, and it's just so beautiful, and the sun is glinting off the water, and the gentle breeze is blowing up the river valley. And all of a sudden he feels a presence next to him. He turns, and there's a surpassingly beautiful young woman. And he's immediately smitten. He immediately falls in love, and he goes to her, and he says, I am the king of this entire realm. I know this is a little bit precipitous. This is a little sudden, but I'm enamored of you. I'd like to make you my queen. And she looks down and says, very demurely, and she says, I will make you a good queen. We will be very happy together. Our lives will be wonderful. But before I say yes, you must promise me one thing. And he says, well, of course, I'll promise you anything. What is it? He was thinking, what could this woman ever ask that I wouldn't be able to cooperate with? And besides, he was so smitten, he wasn't thinking straight. And she says, you must never question anything I do. Okay, everybody, before you get married, think about this. If you can get this. And he said, but of course, and they went back, and they were married, and the entire kingdom rejoiced because now there would be heirs to the king, and she was very noble and gracious and complimented him perfectly, and everything was doing really well. And in the course of time, she became pregnant. And on the day that she gave birth to a son. And the king went to the chambers where she gave birth to see his new son. But in the interim between the birth and him showing up, she had gathered oh so tenderly this beautiful child, wrapped him in silks, held him to her breast, walked out of the palace and down to the river Ganges, waded into the river, and placed the child in. And once he was washed away, she turned with an enigmatic smile on her face and walked back up the banks to the palace. Well, you can imagine how the king felt about this. He was horrified, but he remembered his promise, and his love was strong, so he just didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and time passed. She became pregnant again. She gave birth in time to another son, and this time, too, she gathered the child so tenderly up, wrapped him beautifully in silks, took him down to the river, walked in, and let him go into the river, and came back up. Santanu, the king, was again mortified, but again, his love was stronger. He said nothing. 5 more times this happened. Everything's perfect, but, right? They're very happy together. She's a wonderful queen. They're deeply in love. And yet there's this one fatal flaw. And when she becomes pregnant for the 8th time, he is inert with fear. And when she gives birth to the 8th son, gathers him up, wraps him in silks, and starts to walk out of the palace, he can no longer hold himself back. And he says to her, he says, "What are you doing?" And she looks at him with infinite sadness in her eyes, and she says, "I'm so sorry you've asked, because now our marriage is at an end." And he just looks at her and says, "I don't understand. I just don't understand. You've got to help me." And she says to him, she says, that she is not a mortal at all, that she is the goddess Ganga, she is the goddess, and that she had taken mortal form. And then she tells him this story, that in the heavenly realms there were these 8 celestial beings, these 8 Vasus, they were Gandharvas, and they had been out on a picnic with their wives. Isn't this delicious? They had been out on a picnic with their wives, and one of the wives saw a cow. Now again, this is a metaphor, it's an allegory, and the word literally, the word cow in Hindi means the same as light. It's the same word for light. So this cow belonged to a rishi. Rishis are these nearly perfect beings. They do lots of tapasya, a lot of austerities. They do a lot of yoga and meditation for many years on end, develop this tremendous spiritual power inside. And they're omniscient. And they're almost perfect, except they have this one problem, that whenever somebody crosses them, they turn and they curse them. And they burn up a certain amount of their tapasya, and they have to go make it up, and this poor person who gets cursed has to live out this terrible thing. Well, this cow belonged to a rishi. The Gandharva says, why do you want that cow? She says, because it's got magic properties. The milk makes beings immortal. And he says, we're already immortal. What do you need the milk from this cow for? I have a friend in the land of the mortals, and I want it for her. And she works on him, works on him, works on him. And again, this is not about women and men. This is about the mind, the male quality follows the heart. So this is the heart quality yearning for something. So again, that's the allegory. And anyway, she works on him. He finally says yes, steals the cow. The rishi comes back. Cow is gone. He's omniscient. He sees what's happened. And he appears in front of the 8 Gandharvas. And what does a rishi do when he's angry? He curses. So he curses them all. He says, how dare you take my cow? It doesn't belong to you. I curse you now. You all have to be born as mortals. It's a curse to be born as a mortal, you see, because we are infinite beings. Well, they're very upset by this. They go to the goddess Ganga in the celestial realms, and they tell her what happened, and they say, can you go to this rishi and mitigate this curse? And so she goes, and he feels, once they've given the curse, they always feel a little bad about doing it. But it's done. And so she says to him, they feel a little bad about having to be born as mortals, and he says, well, okay. They have to do it, but they'll have very short lives. They'll have very short lives. All except this one who laid his hands on the cow, and he has to live a long time, but it'll be a great life. He'll be known forever, and it'll be very powerful. So she tells him this, and she says she went back and told them, and they asked her to take mortal birth so that she would be mortal form, so that she would be their mother, and as soon as they were born, to release them. Isn't this wonderful? Because we think we know how it works. We're so certain that we know that it's a tragedy, but when you get a different perspective, and then she says, but this last son, he has to live a long time. She doesn't say why she stood up and gathered him up, but the marriage is over because he questioned. And she says, I will take and I will train him in the celestial realms perfectly to be your heir. And then he becomes, 16 years later, they show back up, and he represents the ego. And there's endless numbers of stories that are just fascinating about how the ego develops and the powers it gets. One of the powers the ego gets, think about this for yourself, the ego gets the power through this self-offering that he makes, that the ego can never be killed. That the ego can never die until it gives itself over, no matter what happens. Isn't that true of us? Until we really give ourselves over. And the ego also says, I will never marry, as a part of what happens. And think about it too, our sense of identity, no matter what happens outwardly, we marry, we don't, we have kids, we don't. For a little while we feel connected, but outwardly, as long as we're ego identified, we're always separate. That's what that represents. We think we know how it works. We're so certain that the offenses of others, the behaviors of others, the things that they do that don't live up to our expectation, is the problem, is the cause of our unhappiness, is the reason that we don't experience God. We miss the point, and the masters come to us to tell us it doesn't look like we think it ought to look. And then they give us the gift of guidance. They give us the gift of techniques. They give us the gift of wisdom, and they give us the gift of their friendship and presence. All along the way, we start to tune in to how life really works, so that the endless joy, the infinite love, the power and wisdom and peace and calmness, that we know intuitively is ours can be awakened within us, and we too, like them, can become channels for it into this world. Let's take a moment of silence together.